morning. How are we doing this morning? We're glad that you're here, whether in person or joining us online. And Genesis 12 is where we're going to pick up the story this morning. In 1929, the stock market crashed, falling nearly 25% in just 2 days. And within 4 years, by 1933, 50% of all U.S. banks were closed. And during that time, unemployment rose to 25%. And the problem with that is that millions of people lost their jobs. And the truth is, there was no unemployment benefits at the time. This became known as the Great Depression, which lasted from 1929 to I think about 1939, when we as a country got involved in World War II. And as a result, it was an incredibly uncomfortable time, maybe one of the most uncomfortable seasons in the life of our country. I have young memories as a kid, sitting at my grandparents' dining table in Florida as we were praying for our meal, and my grandfather would start to cry, and he would talk about after he prayed, he's so grateful for one, for our family to be together, two, for us to be able to have the food that we have, because he lived during the Great Depression. And that was a time that was incredibly uncomfortable, not knowing when you were going to have your next meal. And so when I think about the period that he lived through, it's been significantly more uncomfortable for that period than it's been through the period that I've experienced in my 41 years of life on this earth. The question we want to wrestle with this morning is this: what comes natural when life's uncomfortable? What comes natural when life is uncomfortable? Because sometimes life becomes uncomfortable because of choices that we make, and so it's our fault. Other times, right, there are things that happen around us, other people's decisions, right, actually can affect our own life. Here's the point. We've all faced things and circumstances in life that have absolutely robbed our comfort. Maybe you've received a bad health report before, you've gone through the loss of a job, or maybe you've had tension in a relationship in your marriage, or you've had tension in a relationship with your children or extended family. You see, what happens when we get uncomfortable, right? We don't enjoy it. We're in the middle of a series just started last week called the One Life Movement. And this series is also tied to our church-wide campaign that we're pursuing, that we're trying to raise money for a long-term home for Redemption Church, so we can have our own place to do life and ministry, a place that we can actually call home. But the vision of our church, to see our city redeemed one life at a time, is actually not about a brick and mortar building at all. It's actually all about people and helping people find and experience life change that can only happen in the person and the work of Jesus. But if you're with us last week, we kicked off in Genesis 12, right? And we saw a little bit about the story of Abram. And here's how we defined the One Life Movement. The One Life Movement is a singular focus on every part of me choosing to go where God wants me. So last week, if you're with us, we saw Abram, an idol worshiper. God came and met him and called him to relationship with himself. And so we had an idol worshiper that became a worshiper of God. You see, what happens is that God put Abram at a crossroads. Hey, Abram, you want to join me in what I want to do in your life? Because if you join me, there's going to be crazy amount of blessing in your life. But here's what you have to do, Abram. You have to forsake everything that you know. You have to leave behind your family. You have to leave behind your idols. You have to leave behind everything and step out in courage and in faith and in trust and join me in what I want to do in your life. And so we saw Abram forsake everything. He left his country. He left behind his extended family. Why? Because he wanted to adventure into the blessing and promises that God was actually offering him. And he embraced those promises like a champ. So when we read the story, everything was going exactly right. God calls him. He leaves behind his country. God calls him to another land, but God didn't even tell him where he was going to take him until he first forsake everything. But he forsakes everything. He follows God. He gets into what was called the land of Canaan, eventually the promised land. And God says, I'm going to give this land to you. And we saw Abram set up altars to worship God all throughout the land of Canaan, worshiping God for what he was going to do. It seemed easy. It seemed great. It seemed textbook. He was walking with God and worshiping God and obeying God. Life was good. Here's the question. What's going to happen in Abram's life when his world gets turned upside down? What happens in your life when it's uncomfortable? What comes natural when life's uncomfortable? 3 ways we're going to see this morning that we derail God's movement. Right, and here's the first. We're going to pick it up in verse 10, and we're going to see this, that we flee the Father. Verse 10 says this, now there was a famine in the land. So Abram went down to Egypt to sojourn there, for the famine was severe in the land. So what's the setting? The setting is this. There is a famine in the land, and that sets the stage in a very particular way because God brought Abram to this land, and when they get to the land, eventually there's a shortage of food. By the way, do you think this would create desperation in Abram? Think about being ahead of his family. Right? His family had left everything they had to come into this land, and now there's a famine. They don't have food. You see, you go into survival mode. You're responsible not just for yourself, but you're also responsible for those you actually love. How did the text describe the famine? Did you catch that in verse 10? It described it as severe. So just so we're on the same page, this was not like when COVID happened and you had to go find toilet paper and you went to Meijer and the aisle was empty, okay? That's not this. This is life and death. Like this is described as severe. What has to be true for something to be labeled a famine? Well, what has to be true is this. It has to be an extended period of time, right? He didn't miss breakfast that day. It's been a while. It's been an extended period of time where his family has not had any food. I don't know about you, but I've never experienced that in my life. I've never experienced a famine. It's never been part of my life in our country or in the home that I grew up in. I never actually had to worry if I was going to have another meal. I don't know how long you've gone without eating. I think for most of us, we're probably more worried about what's our 4th meal of the day going to be more than breakfast, lunch, or dinner. Am I right on that? Okay. Like that's actually how we live. But when I think about not eating, I think back to an event that I did when I was a student ministry pastor. We did something called the 30-hour famine, and some of you participated are actually here in the room this morning. And what we would ask our students to do is go raise money to not eat for 30 hours, and we'd use that money, right, to go towards mission. So we'd raise about $15,000 in this event that we did, right, called the 30-hour famine. And so it was a very weird experience to not eat for 30 hours. And then what we would do is we would break the fast by going to Mongolian barbecue in Grand Rapids, and all you could eat, and we just let the kids plow, and it was awesome. I challenged them, eat the restaurant out of food, right? Make them close it down, right? We take 60 kids over there, right? And so it was a wild experience, but here's the thing. Was that actually a famine? Was the 30-hour famine a famine? No, it was a fast. And there's a difference, right? We fast for deliberate choices to pursue God, to trust God for a variety of different kinds of reasons. This was not planned. This was not the plan that Abram had for his life or for his family to actually go without eating. So can I make this observation? There's a reality gap in Abram's life between what God has promised and what he was experiencing. Ever been there before? A reality gap between what God actually promises in his word to you and what you're actually experiencing in life. Because that's real for Abram in this moment, and he's desperate, and desperate times often lead us to make mistakes. And if we're not careful, guess what happens? We allow our desperation to dictate the decisions we make and the directions that we actually go. And so what did Abram do in desperation? It says he went down to Egypt. Why? Because the famine was severe. So here's his plan. Hey, we're going to leave the land that God brought us to. We're going to go down to Egypt because we're starving, because we're in a famine. We're just going to stay there for a little bit. And then once the famine is over, we're going to come back to the land that God called us to go to, and everything's going to be okay. Let me be clear. Abram's not abandoning God here, right? He's not abandoning God. If he was going to abandon God, he would go back to Haran where his extended family was, or go back to the land of Ur that we saw last week, back to his old gods and all that he's actually from. But what he's doing is he's trying to care for his family. So what does he do? He goes to Egypt. Why Egypt? Egypt had something called the Nile River. And while Egypt had influence and Egypt had power, here's the thing. Egypt had food because of this great river. So that means this. Going to Egypt would have been the natural decision to make. Hey, church, the natural decision is not always the best decision. The natural decision is not always the best decision. The natural decision is often void of the Holy Spirit. What do I mean by that? We see this text right here. Coming out of last week, he was worshiping God. That's how the text ended. And here we have him in a land with a famine. It's severe. There's no food. And we see no mention of God. We see no worship. We see no praying out to God. We see no crying out to God. We see no seeking God in this very moment. Which helps us understand this. Just like Abram, the way that we most often flee the Father is by forgetting the Father. And when I say forget, what I mean is this. We forget, we don't stop believing in who God actually is, but we simply forget about the greatness of God. And we have this scenario, we have this circumstance that we're facing, and it seems that God has made promises and he's not coming through, and why would he bring us here and allow this to experience? There's this reality gap between what he promised and what we're experiencing in life. And so, yeah, we don't stop believing in God, but we stop trusting in the greatness of God. He doesn't seem to be recounting the promises that God made to him. We don't see him fleeing back to Genesis 12, 1 through 3, all the 5 great, amazing, ridiculous promises that God made him. We don't see him going back to those and revisiting those and trusting in what God actually said. In other words, Abram could say this: God, I've held up to my side of the bargain. You asked me to leave my family. You asked me to leave my religion, and I've left. And now I'm in this land where you promised me all sorts of blessing, and we're gonna die if we don't get food. Like, that's a serious scenario. I think for us in West Michigan, let me be clear. I think fleeing God is not always intentional. It's subtle. It's subtle, right? And for Abram, they're starving. Now, here's what's true. If he dies, God's promises cannot become reality. It couldn't actually happen. So what did he have to do? He had to take matters into his own hands. So he gave God control earlier. Now he's actually gonna take it back, and he's gonna leave the land that God called him to. He's gonna go down to Egypt to get food so they don't starve. It seems very simple and very easy. But his leaving of God was not intentional. It was subtle. It was a reflexive response, I would say, to the situation that resulted in him doing what we do, which is turning to our own devices. Hey, church, did you know that when we are left to ourselves, the most natural decision that we can make is to run to what we know best every single time? And so we make decisions, and we don't consider God's word, and we don't consider what the Spirit would want, and we just go on our way, and we do what we actually want to do. We don't seek God's will, we don't pray to him, we don't worship him, we just make decisions. Why? Because that's the natural thing for us to do. We do what we think is actually best. Why? Because we're less concerned about what God thinks, and we're most concerned about what we think. Honest question for you. What are the most natural decisions that you make? If we're gonna make just natural decisions, what do those decisions look like in your life? Because for all of us, they might look a little bit different. But here's the truth. If you know Jesus, I wanna be honest with you, there's a war happening within you about what's natural and what's spiritual. There's tension between you making natural decisions and you making a Spirit-led decision, and that is a real war that happens in every single believer. In fact, we could go look at texts like the end of Romans 1 or the Galatians chapter 5. Before you get to the fruit of the Spirit, you can see the fruit of the flesh, right? All these things that are actually natural to us. But let me make my own list for us this morning. Let me share just a few. Let me share 5 things that we do when we make natural decisions. And the first is this, is we choose isolation. We choose isolation. When we want to make the natural decision, here's what we're gonna do. We're gonna pull away from people, we're gonna pull away from community, and we're gonna do our own thing. And why do we do that? Well, it comes to the next one. It's because of pride. It's because of pride that we do that. It's because of what's happening in our own heart as to why we pull away, and it's really about me. And then it comes down to selfishness, I would say third. And then guess what happens is people want to call you, they want to knock on your door, they want to text you, they want to reach out to you, they want to grab coffee with you, grab a lunch with you, they want to have a relationship with you. And the problem with that is you get defensive when people call you out. Why? Because you chose isolation. Because that's the natural thing for you to actually do. Why? Because lastly, it's all about self-preservation. We want to control the narrative, and we want to do what we think is actually best. Hey, listen, the natural choice is not always the best choice. Spirit-led decisions are always the best decision. Spirit-led decisions actually require the presence of the Spirit in your life. And so the first way that we often derail the movement of God is that we flee the Father. But let me share the second way. The second way is that we fall to fear. Let's look at verse 11 in the story. It says, when he was about to enter Egypt, he said to Sarai, his wife, I know that you are a beautiful woman in appearance. When the Egyptians see you, they will say, this is his wife. Then they will kill me, but they will not let you live. So you are my sister, that it may go well with me because of you, and that my life may be spared for your sake. When Abram entered Egypt, the Egyptians saw that the woman was very beautiful. And when the princes of Pharaoh saw her, they praised her to Pharaoh. And the woman was taken into Pharaoh's house. And for her sake, he dealt well with Abram. And he had sheep and oxen and male donkeys and male servants and female donkeys and camels. Crazy story. So here's the next way that we derail the movement of God, is that we fall to fear. So here's the point. Abram now has a decision to make. He forgot about the God who's called him out of idolatry. His faith and trust have actually shifted from God, who casted this ridiculous vision over his life that we saw last week. And now he's taking his plans into his own account. He's going to do what he wants to do. How do we know that Abram lost faith and lost trust? He's going to a land by leaving the land that God actually called him to. And so this situation is requiring him again to actually take control. And so once again, he's freely going to do what he wants to do. In other words, here's what he's doing. He's panicking. Ever panicked in a situation before? Ever felt overwhelmed in such a way that you didn't know what to do? And so your knee-jerk reaction is really motivated out of panicking at what God is actually doing and what he's allowing to happen in your life? It says that he's heading down to Egypt. Before he enters Egypt, here's the point. Again, there's no mention of God. There's no seeking God out on the journey. He's doing what he actually wants to do. Listen, fear is the result when our problems trump the promises of God. Fear is the result when our problems trump the promises of God. Because here's the thing, when you choose to flee God, even when it's subtle, I just want to be honest with you, fear is not far behind. And so we see Abram, he's ready to enter into Egypt, and fear has trumped his faith. Now let me ask you a question. Is it sin to experience fear? Is it sin to experience fear? Is it sin to be overwhelmed by a situation in life? The answer is no. That's actually called being human, right? And so the truth is we will experience fear. We will be overwhelmed because we live in a sinful, broken world. But here's the thing. Just because you experience fear doesn't mean it has to trump your faith. So here's the question. When will fear trump faith? Here's the answer. Fear will trump faith when it dictates your next move. Fear will trump faith every time when it dictates your next move. When fear's in charge, it leads to sin. And by the way, the opposite is also true, that faith will trump fear when faith dictates your next move. In other words, both fear and faith, right, are gonna lead you to make decisions. They're just gonna go in opposite directions. You see, it'll either be the direction you want to go, which is fear, or it'll be the decision that God wants you to make, which will actually be in faith. And so when faith dictates your next move, your next choice, your next decision, it'll always result in you running towards God. But when fear dictates the call, dictates the next decision, the next opportunity, it'll always lead to you running away from God. True. right? Have you experienced this before in your life? No, I've never panicked over a famine, and I'm sure you haven't either. But there's been many other situations in my life where I've seen fear trump faith. There's been many observations and times when I've panicked in life, and I'm sure on a human level you would say the same. As a pastor, for being a pastor for 17 years, it's been very interesting to stand on the sidelines sometimes and watch decisions that Christians actually make. Because I've seen fear trump faith in many examples. Maybe you've seen it too. I've seen it happen when a presidential election doesn't go the way that you want it to go. I've seen people lose their mind, right? What happened? Fear trumped faith. By the way, when the election doesn't go the way that you want it to go, is God still on the throne? Absolutely yes. Listen, we saw people panic and we saw people have fear over faith when COVID actually hit. And I don't care if you're pro-mask, anti-mask, or pro-vaccine, anti-vaccine, any of those decisions can be made in faith or fear. Is that fair? And so what ends up happening is we've seen people get so afraid, right, that they shut their life down. By the way, is God still on the throne when a pandemic happens? The answer is, I can't hear you. Yes. He's on the throne. I've seen people lose a job, which is incredibly painful when you want to care for your family. And fear trumps faith. Is God still on the throne when you lose a job? It's not always encouraging, but the answer is yes. Yes. You see, fear is our move when we want to control the situation, and faith is our move when we want to trust God in the situation. Are you understanding the difference there? You see, our fear will either trump faith, or faith can actually trump our fear. But when fear arises, do you run to God in faith, or do you actually run from God? Because we see Abram, he's heading down to Egypt. Listen, where do you run when fear arises? Because here's the thing, you don't go down to the land of Egypt. That's not where I go. But what land do you go to when fear arises? Where do you run, church? Because here's what we do. We're going to run to a place to self-medicate the pain. And we all have different kinds of lands that we run to when we want to medicate what's actually happening. In other words, you're going to turn to your own vices in life to medicate everything. And guess what happens? When that happens, because fear's calling the shots in your life, the ugly head of your idols are going to appear. The idols in our life become very clear. And so you might run to the land of food. You might just overindulge. You might run to the land of alcohol because you want to get to the end of the bottle to not remember what's happening in your life. You might run to lust because you just want to throw your life into being that and trying to find pleasure. You might throw yourself in overworking and you're going to work 70, 80, 90 hours a week because you don't want to go home and deal with what's actually really happening in your life. You may just pour yourself into your family and drown everything else out. You may go on a shopping spree and spend crazy amounts of money and build up crazy amount of debt because you want to feel good and deal with the fear in your own way. I don't know what land is that you run to. I just want to be clear. No matter where you run in fear, no matter what you choose to self-medicate with, it's going to cost you something. It's going to cost you time. It's going to cost you energy. It's going to cost you sleep. It's going to cost you finances. It may cost you your relationships in your life. You see, fear can crumble our relationships. Fear can crumble our lives, and fear can rob our bank accounts. You see, here's what's happening for Abram. His idols are being exposed. What are Abram's idols when we see the story? We know what God promised last week. We saw it. But here he is being human, right? Doing the most natural thing. Here's what Abram's idols are. It's safety and security. He loves safety and security more than he loves the Lord. Can we zoom out just for a minute and try to give ourselves the perspective that God would have by what we know about God and his word? That God is outside time and space. We've seen that in Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God, right? He's eternal, he's infinite, he's limitless, right? So his view on everything is seeing how everything he's created at one time. He sees all of time at once. So everything that happens in your life in the very beginning that we get robbed by and we experience fear, we don't know what the outcome's gonna be, he already knows the outcome. That's the point of him being on the throne. So if that's true, can we make this observation? Is it possible that God was using the famine, this severe famine, no joke of a famine, not eating, we're dying for food. Is it possible that God was using that famine to expose the idols of Abram's heart? If the answer is yes, that then means we can say this, that we know that God is actually sovereign on the throne over everything that we're ever going to experience in our life. We're talking about the creator of the universe, right? And if that's true, that means this: nothing can invade your life without God's permission. Not a single thing can invade your life without God's permission. And God will graciously use every single circumstance in your life to make you more like him. So what God is doing, what God's allowing to happen in Abram's life is he's pressing in on Abram. He's allowing the famine to stretch him in ways he never thought he could be stretched. And as a result, he's going to use it to make him more like him. And the same is true for every difficult thing you've ever faced in your life. All of it has purpose to God. All of it has value, and he's not going to waste a single minute of it. So what does that mean? It means this, that God is more committed to you than you will ever be to him. God is more committed to you than you will ever be to him. Let's go back to the story. Abram's heading to Egypt. He's doing that because there's a famine. He's doing that because they're starving. And guess what happens? The choice of fear leading the way, it creates a domino effect in all the decisions he's about to make. You see, remember, God made all sorts of promises. I'm gonna bless you. I'm gonna make your name great. I'm gonna give you a great family. All the families of the earth will be blessed by you. What was the problem? Remember the barrier? His wife Sarah was barren, right? It's impossible for her to have kids. And God said, no, there's barriers don't exist for me, Abram. And he doesn't really remember that in the moment. But the domino effect of fear is dictating all the choices that he actually makes. And so he heads to Egypt, and fear makes the next decision for him. He's now afraid. Why is he afraid in the story we read? Because his wife is beautiful, right? His wife is beautiful. And he thinks that's going to be a problem for him. Fear is compelling him to make a new decision. It's compelling him to try to grab control. And so his whole entire decision-making, his whole entire strategy was dictated by fear. You see, here's the thing, Sarah. When we get to Egypt, they're gonna kill me because of your beauty. Question, how did he know that? Fear told him. Fear actually told him that. By the way, I don't think there's any examples of that in the scripture. If we're gonna give one example, we could talk about in 2 Samuel when King David takes Bathsheba, who's not his wife, gets her pregnant, and has her husband killed out on the line of duty. That's like the one at God's man. That's the one example I can actually think when I think about that. He's afraid to go into this country for food because he's afraid now that his wife might actually, her beauty might result in his death. Question. What kind of voice does fear have in your life? And does the voice of fear drown out the voice of God? Because fear has a domino effect. And so what did Sarai do when they got down to Egypt? What did he want her to do? Hey, tell the Egyptians that you're my sister. By the way, that's a half-truth because it's actually his half-sister. Tell them that you're my sister. Why do this? I want to see the key phrase again because it reveals everything about his heart in verse 13. Look at what it says. Say you are my sister. Why? That it may go well with me. Oh, there it is. Now we're seeing everything that we actually need to see. This is actually all about you, Abram. You have very little concern and love for what might be best for your wife, and you're making a decision based on you. This tells me everything that I actually need to know in my life about Abram. Church, your death is not a you issue, it's a God issue. God decides when all our time is actually up. And God made promises to Abram that, one, required him to be alive, so he could have trusted God. Two, it required him to be married to his wife. Because God wanted him to be with Sarai, who was barren, so he could do what he wanted to do, which means if Abram dies, the promises of God cannot become reality. This is a problem of what's actually happening here. So put yourself in Sarai's shoes. So Sarah, we're about to enter this land, Egypt. We're trying to get some food. But here's the thing. You're so beautiful, they might kill me. So what I need to do is I need you to tell them that you're my sister so that I don't die, that it may go well with you. Do you think Sarah could have been like, hey, babe, can we come up with a better plan? Because this plan could result in me becoming someone else's wife. Are you thinking about how this could play out? I wonder if she would like to have changed the strategy. Honest question. Do you have clear things that you wish your spouse would change about themselves? My wife has very clear scenarios. Let me share a few of them with you. My wife can't stand, well, I'll share that one next. Let me share the first one. My wife thinks I have terrible vision. Here's the problem. I have perfect vision. I've exercised my eyes my entire life, right? I have perfect vision at 41 years old, but she thinks this, men can't see as well as women. Now, if you know my wife and her story, she's got like $8,000 contacts because of her battle with cancer and all the things that she's faced, right? So she's got like these super lenses that she actually wears. And so, but here's the thing, she thinks that I can't see well. Here's an example. She's cutting something up on the island. Josh, I need you to go in the fridge, and I need you to grab the glass jar that's on the second shelf. So it's not the top shelf, Josh. It's in the middle shelf, and it's not the bottom shelf. It's right in the middle, and it's right in the very front of the fridge. And I'll open the fridge, and I'll stand there, and I'll stare at what she wants me to get, and I can't see it. It's not there. She'll say, it's the glass jar, not the plastic bin. I need you to get it out of the fridge. And I'll say, babe, it's not there. So what does she do? She just comes right in front of me. She goes, it's this, it's right here. It's right in front of your face. Anyone else? This your story? Okay. And I'll just tell her, that actually just appeared. That was not there because I have perfect vision. Scenario number 2, she doesn't like how I brush my teeth. Okay, what I mean by that is this. I turn the water on when I'm about ready to spit. I turn the water on for about 10 seconds before I spit. She can't stand it because I'm throwing money down the drain. Why can't you turn the water on at the exact same time? We have this conversation once a week. I've been doing this for 41 years. It's not changing, right? I want the water to be cold, right? That's what I want in my life. Scenario number 3, she can't stand how I wash dishes. All right? Well, because what I do is I keep the water running because I want to use clean water to wash the dishes, not dirty water. I don't know why this is such a big deal, but I wash the dishes, right? I'm washing, then I rinse them off. I might keep it running for a while, wash the next dish, wash the pots and pans, keep it going. She can't stand it because I'm wasting money. I don't know what it is with all you Dutch people. I don't get it. I don't understand it. 90% of you will not be back next week. Yeah, right. I wonder if Sarah wishes she could change some things in her husband here. Hey, Abram, this isn't the best strategy. Here's the point. Fear is compelling Abram's decisions, and they're crazy choices. So guess what happens? His wife is given away. We read it. His wife is given away to Pharaoh. And in return, what does he get? He gets riches. He gets all sorts of animals, donkeys and camels, and he even gets servants. He gets other people to be part of his tribe now. But he lost his wife with his decision. Are you seeing the domino effect of fear here? Hey, church, fear derails faith. 3 movements, or 3 ways we derail God's movement. Here's the third, is that we fail to fix. Let's look at the text. Verse 17, it says this, but the Lord afflicted Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarai, Abram's wife. So Pharaoh called to Abram and said, what is this that you have done to me? Why did you not tell me that she was your wife? Why did you say she is my sister, that I took her for my wife? Pharaoh says, now then, here's your wife, take her and go. And Pharaoh gave men orders concerning him, and they sent him away with his wife and all that he had. So again, his fear derailed his faith. And so at this point in the story, Sarai is somewhere else, and Abram is sitting with all his donkeys and all his new servants that he just met, right? And I wonder if he's thinking, yes, I got exactly what I wanted to get. Like, this went exactly as I was hoping it would actually go. By the way, what do you think Sarai is actually thinking? Because remember, the blessing that was going to Abram, she had a significant role in that with the barrier in her life of being barren. Right, which was a significant barrier. And so the vision that God casted to Abram, she was getting to be a part of. But all of that has been thrown away because of Abram's fear. The great vision that God casted over them both is now actually gone, because the new vision for Sarai's life is this. She's no longer going to be used for the glory of God. She's going to be used for the glory of Pharaoh. Think about this. She had the privilege and the blessing of being stuck in Pharaoh's harem. She got the privilege and the blessing of using her body to entertain Pharaoh. And then she's gonna die in Egypt after the great life she gets to actually live there. She's gonna be placed in a royal tomb. And the extent of her vision is now that she gets to be the next Egyptian mummy. Incredible vision for her life now, right? What a contrast from what God said he wants to do in Genesis 12, 1-3. To what now is going to be actually become reality. So make no mistake, Abram's fear had significant effects on Sarai. By the way, that means this, is that your fear will affect everybody around you, that our sin choices create ripple effects. So does this text not clearly expose the loyalties of Abram's heart? God is not in the driver's seat. Abram actually is. And God's vision cannot become reality anymore, right? Because Abram is doing what he wants to do. Or maybe Abram thinks, I'm gonna help God make it reality so I can stay alive and we can work this plan out together. So I know what he'll do. We'll go to Egypt. I'll have my wife lie about who she is. And then as a result, everything's actually going to work out. I'm promoting the work of God by lying is what he's thinking. Was that the vision that God actually casted? Let's review for a minute, church, because this is important. The vision that God casted was about God doing the work and Abram responding in obedience. Are you hearing me? The vision was about God doing the work. I will, God said. I will, God said. I will, God said. Here's what I need, Abram. I simply just need you to be obedient. Respond to the blessings that I want to actually give you. I will do the work. I will make you great. I will do what cannot be done in your life because there's a barrier that you could never overcome. And so I wonder if Abram is sitting there with all his servants, doesn't even know their names, all these animals that he has, that he's gathered. And I wonder if he's thinking, what did I just do? Hey, church, this is where we find ourselves in the story. Because what could Abram do to actually fix the outcome? The answer is nothing. Is he gonna go knock on Pharaoh's door? It's done. Pharaoh's done with you. He gave you money and gifts and animals and people for your wife. He can't fix the situation. He failed so miserably, he can't change the outcome. That's you and I. We've all failed miserably. We've all lived for the glory of ourselves, and look where it's gotten us. And we can't do anything to change our eternal outcome. But here's the thing. What if God can? What if God can? Because Abram's made a crazy mess of his whole life. And he can't now make a decision to undo what he actually did. And so what's true for Abram is actually true for us, is that we make a mess and we can't fix it. Hey, church, the gospel reveals bad news, but the gospel rescues with the best news. And what I mean by that is this, is that we know right here, we can see it again, that every one of us is fully known by God, yet fully loved by the Lord. And we're doomed unless God gets involved. And in verse 17, look at the phrase, but the Lord. But the Lord. So we saw in Genesis 12:1, God take the initiative for a relationship with Abram. And now Abram's kind of walked away in faith or in fear, doing what he wants to do. And what is God doing? God's taking the initiative again, that even when you and I attempt to throw away the promises of God, God will resurrect them out of the trash because he's more committed to his plan than you will ever be to him. He's going to do what he has to do. God does not need your help to accomplish his plan. And it's God's responsibility to make his promises reality. And it's our responsibility to trust him to the end. And so what did God do? He afflicted a great plague, it says, on Pharaoh. Great plague probably references some kind of really rough skin disease. Most likely, Sarai was untouched. So he then knew that this was an issue with her. And so he brought her back to Abram and said, here's your wife back. Why did you lie to me? I took her as my wife, he said. You see, Pharaoh wanted Sarai out of his house and he wanted Abram out of Egypt. And there was nothing that Pharaoh could do to change this outcome. He had a plague. He didn't want anything to do with Abram's God. Get out of my land. By the way, did you notice what Abram didn't do in Egypt that he did earlier in Bethel? He didn't build an altar in Egypt. He doesn't worship God in Egypt. He seems stunned and he seems quiet. What do you think Sarai and Abram's conversation was like on the way back to the God's land? Hey babe, so good to see you. I think it was probably rough. Our gospel takeaway this morning is this, is that when we derail our lives, God is always ready to invade our wreckage. Here's the beautiful thing about God's commitment to you. He's not going to allow fear to have the last say. God takes the initiative, which we learn this. He's not going to allow our sin to dictate and win. God has a plan, and God is incredibly committed to his plan. So even when we derail everything, God is saying this, no matter what you do, my promise to you will become reality. Why? Because God's promises are not based on you. They're not based on me. They're not based on what we've done or not done. They're strictly based on who God actually is. And he's a God of promises, and he promises to do and come through for you even when you choose to derail what he's actually promised. You see, he invades our mess and does what he's going to do. Hey church, God's promises are his to keep, not ours to derail. And here's what I know. You can run to God or you can run away from God. But I want to be clear with you, no matter where you're at with Jesus today, whether you know Jesus or don't know Jesus, he's on a massive pursuit of you. If you're here sitting in this chair, it's because God has ordained for you to be here this very day, and he's coming after you with the love that will change your life, with something that can do what only he can actually do. And he has ridiculous amounts of promises that he wants to bestow on your life. And it's greater than just getting eternity with Jesus in heaven. It's significantly greater than that. It gives you purpose and value in the life now, and that's what's called the One Life movement. And so the question is, what needs to be realigned now to avoid self-inflicted wreckage? Let me give you two options that you have. Option one is this, is that you can assess the pain you want. What do I mean? Listen, these can play out how you want them to play out. Assess the pain that you want. You can assess the pain of change, or you can assess the pain of staying the same. Here's the thing. Both of them, right, have their own duration to them. Both of them have their own intensity to them. You can stay the same and change nothing in your life, right? That'll have its own pain, and it'll be life enduring. Or you can choose to change, and it's painful to change, but it's shorter, and it has way more blessing and beauty actually in it, which then means this. You want the movement of God to happen in your life? What needs to change? Because you will never change until the pain of staying the same grows greater than the pain of change. Here's the second option. You can accept the promise you want. God, just like Abram, wants to bestow upon you blessing after blessing after blessing. And you can choose to step in this life, that all that God has for you, and it starts with the person, the work of Jesus Christ, who loves you so deeply that God sent his own son to die in your place. You can start there. Or you can say, no, I'm gonna pursue the blessings of the world, which, by the way, will end up being a mummy. Like, that was all Sarai could experience in her life. That was the extent of the blessing. God's pursuing you. You get to decide, what do you want to accept in your life? Do you want to accept that? What pain do you want to accept? And what promise do you actually want to accept in your life? Let's pray. Jesus, I want to thank you for your love for us and your commitment to us. Lord, the story of Abram, Lord, I so clearly see myself in it. Looking out for self, making the most natural choices and decisions. But Lord, I know that you're moving and you're working and you're changing lives. So Lord, I want to pray this morning for anyone in the room that doesn't know you. They've never placed your faith and trust in you, that today will be the day that they'll recognize that you are a beautiful God who's pursuing them, and that they too will embrace the love that you have for them. Lord, I want to thank you for your word and how it reveals the idols of our own hearts. And I want to pray for Redemption Church, and I want us to consider, Lord, where is that we need to change on an individual level. We love you, Jesus, in your name. Amen.